Joining me now, Karoline Leavitt, White House Press Secretary. Karoline, you were in the room where it all happened. Take us inside that room for a moment, would you? And then please tell us what you believe the president will say in response to what Zelenskyy said on Bret Baier's show.
Karoline Leavitt, when asked about her presence during critical moments and the insights she could provide regarding the situation, offered a detailed perspective on the tensions that arose during President Zelenskyy's visit to the White House. She explained how things escalated much faster than anyone anticipated, citing the complex dynamics between the leaders and their differing views on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. According to Leavitt, the root of the problem lay in the fact that President Zelenskyy was still not prepared to fully accept the evolving political reality that had emerged with the arrival of President Donald Trump in the White House. Leavitt's assessment of the situation emphasized that while Zelenskyy's country had been embroiled in a devastating conflict for years, with its people suffering greatly, Zelenskyy himself had failed to understand the shift in leadership and the changing priorities in Washington. The U.S. public, Leavitt noted, was no longer willing to continue supporting the war financially, and President Trump recognized this, seeking to bring an end to the prolonged conflict. This was the reality Zelenskyy was failing to grasp. Trump was not like previous presidents. He understood the American public's wariness with the war and was determined to put an end to it, not by escalating the situation further, but by looking for alternative solutions. However, Leavitt noted that when Zelenskyy arrived at the White House, his approach made things more complicated rather than helping to facilitate a potential breakthrough. She observed that Zelenskyy came with a set of demands, without fully appreciating the sacrifices the American people had already made in supporting Ukraine's defense. This lack of acknowledgement for the U.S. role in assisting Ukraine created a barrier to meaningful dialogue. Leavitt stated that Zelenskyy's tone and approach only deepened the divide between the two leaders. He seemed to treat the situation as though the U.S. should be doing more without recognizing the immense strain the prolonged conflict had put on the American public, which was growing increasingly less supportive of continuing to fund the war at such an enormous cost. Leavitt pointed out that as the meeting unfolded, President Trump and his team had made more progress toward peace in a short amount of time than had been made in the previous years. Trump's primary focus was to end the war, and in his view, a peaceful resolution was possible if both sides could come to the table with a willingness to compromise. However, Zelenskyy's inability to acknowledge the American public's sentiments and his insistence on imposing his own conditions without a genuine understanding of the need for a change in approach frustrated the negotiations. According to Leavitt, the situation reached a tipping point when Zelenskyy was adamant about pushing his own terms, even as he was on the verge of securing an important economic deal. Despite the potential for an agreement that could have brought significant benefits for Ukraine, Zelenskyy's rigidity and refusal to adapt his demands to the changing political landscape in the U.S. led to a breakdown in talks. The economic deal, which had been viewed as a promising step toward progress, became derailed by Zelenskyy's unwillingness to engage in a more flexible, collaborative manner. Leavitt was clear in her belief that President Trump had always been committed to peace and had demonstrated a genuine willingness to explore new avenues for resolution. She explained that in the brief time Trump had been in office, his team had been able to make more headway toward ending the conflict than had been achieved in the years prior. The negotiations had been progressing, but Zelenskyy's failure to adjust his approach was hindering any potential breakthrough. Leavitt stressed that Trump's administration had been trying to bring peace to Ukraine, but Zelenskyy's responses and actions were undermining these efforts. At one point, the situation grew so tense that a scheduled lunch with President Zelenskyy was canceled. Leavitt shed light on this decision, clarifying that the cancellation was not a spur-of-the-moment decision, but rather a calculated move by President Trump. After careful consideration, Trump came to the conclusion that Zelenskyy was not in a mental space that would allow for meaningful negotiations. Leavitt explained that Trump recognized that continuing with the meeting under the circumstances would not yield any productive results. Instead of continuing with a potentially unfruitful dialogue, Trump chose to take a step back, realizing that the situation had reached an impasse. The decision to cancel the lunch was a stark reflection of the growing frustrations on both sides. For Leavitt, it was a sign that the president had run out of patience with Zelenskyy's approach. She explained that Trump was always looking for opportunities to bring about a positive resolution, but the lack of flexibility on Zelenskyy's part made it impossible to move forward. In Leavitt's view, the president was trying to create an environment where both parties could engage in honest, constructive dialogue, but Zelensky's unwillingness to recognize the political and economic realities in the U.S. prevented that from happening. In addition to the canceled lunch, Leavitt also discussed the broader implications of the breakdown in negotiations. She stressed that the situation had quickly deteriorated because of a fundamental failure in communication and understanding between the two leaders. Trump, in her assessment, was doing everything in his power to de-escalate the conflict and reach a peaceful resolution, but Zelensky's approach complicated those efforts. Leavitt attributed much of the failure to Zelensky's inability to adapt his strategy to the shifting political environment in the U.S., a failure that ultimately led to the breakdown in negotiations and the suspension of what had been a promising dialogue. Leavitt concluded by reiterating that the lack of progress could not solely be blamed on one party or the other. Both sides had contributed to the stalemate, but in her view, the larger burden fell on Zelensky's shoulders for failing to adjust to the new dynamics under President Trump. She emphasized that the political landscape in the U.S. had changed with the arrival of a new president, and it was Zelensky's responsibility to recognize this shift and adapt his approach accordingly. Instead, by continuing to make demands without acknowledging the sacrifices and efforts made by the American people, he had sabotaged the potential for a breakthrough. In the end, Leavitt's analysis painted a picture of a rapidly escalating and deteriorating situation, one that could have been mitigated with a more flexible, adaptive approach on Zelensky's part. She believed that President Trump had shown a genuine willingness to find a peaceful resolution, but without a change in mindset from Zelensky, any progress was doomed to fail. The situation highlighted the importance of recognizing political realities and being willing to adjust one's approach in order to make meaningful progress toward peace. President Trump has made it clear that he wants to bring an end to the ongoing conflict, driven by his understanding that the American public is increasingly opposed to spending billions of dollars on the war. However, the situation became more complicated when President Zelensky visited the White House, as his approach during the visit only worsened the possibility of a resolution. Despite the U.S. offering significant support to Ukraine, Zelensky's continued demands for more aid without acknowledging the sacrifices the American people have already made only deepened the tension between the two leaders. Zelensky's approach was particularly problematic when the two leaders were on the verge of a crucial economic agreement. The deal had the potential to stabilize Ukraine's economy while easing the financial burden on U.S. taxpayers. Yet, Zelensky remained inflexible, insisting on imposing his own terms, which ultimately derailed the talks. President Trump made it clear that the agreement would not only provide vital support to Ukraine, but it would also help reduce the financial strain on the American public. However, Zelensky's unwillingness to compromise and his insistence on pursuing a one-sided agreement ended any hopes of a productive resolution. The failure of these talks underscored the challenges of navigating complex international issues when one party is unwilling to show flexibility or gratitude. Zelensky's refusal to recognize the contributions and sacrifices made by the American people caused further frustration. President Trump's stance on the issue also reflected a growing sentiment among Americans who believe it is time to reassess the level of U.S. involvement in the conflict, especially when foreign leaders are not willing to cooperate and demonstrate the necessary diplomatic goodwill. When asked whether President Trump would be willing to revisit the agreement, Karoline Leavitt emphasized that President Trump has always prioritized peace. She pointed out that since his election, President Trump has been committed to ending the war and working toward a peaceful resolution. In fact, Leavitt noted that in just 1 month, President Trump and his team made more progress toward peace than had been made in the past 3 years combined. However, she acknowledged that the specific agreement in question faced significant challenges, mainly due to President Zelensky's behavior. The agreement was supposed to focus on economic development, but Zelensky kept diverting the conversation to issues such as security guarantees and European matters. These issues were already being addressed through separate negotiations with European leaders, including France and the UK. Leavitt suggested that if Zelensky had approached the discussions with a more cooperative attitude, the agreement could have been reached. Instead, his actions and mindset ultimately sabotaged the opportunity for a deal. The lack of flexibility on Zelensky's part prevented the talks from progressing, even though the economic agreement had the potential to help both Ukraine and the U.S. While Zelensky's insistence on bringing up unrelated matters may have been understandable from his perspective, it ultimately made it difficult for President Trump to move forward in a productive manner. Another key moment in the negotiations occurred when President Trump canceled a planned lunch with Zelensky. Karoline Leavitt explained that this decision was made by President Trump himself, after realizing that Zelenskyy was not mentally prepared to engage in a peace agreement at that moment. According to Leavitt, the cancellation was not just a diplomatic move, but a practical one. President Trump had been prepared for a constructive conversation and hoped for a productive dialogue, but once it became clear that the negotiations were unlikely to be fruitful, he chose to cancel the meeting and move on. Leavitt stressed that the decision was not made impulsively but was based on the understanding that continuing under the circumstances would not lead to a meaningful resolution. The ball, as Leavitt sees it, is now in Zelenskyy's court. She emphasized that if Zelenskyy genuinely desires peace, he will need to demonstrate a willingness to change his approach and engage in a more positive, flexible manner. Until then, President Trump remains committed to peace, but he is unwilling to compromise on the need for a productive and sincere approach from all parties involved. Leavitt's view is that the success or failure of future negotiations will largely depend on Zelenskyy's actions. If he is willing to adjust his stance and approach the discussions with a more cooperative attitude, there may still be opportunities for progress. In conclusion, the failure of the talks between President Trump and President Zelenskyy highlights the complexities of international diplomacy, particularly when one party is unwilling to adapt to changing circumstances. President Trump's commitment to ending the conflict and prioritizing peace is clear, but it requires cooperation from other parties, particularly Zelenskyy, who must demonstrate a willingness to compromise and acknowledge the contributions made by the American people. Until that happens, the prospect of a successful resolution remains uncertain, and the future of U.S.-Ukraine relations will depend on Zelenskyy's ability to engage in a more constructive dialogue moving forward.